So you've got a camera, and you're wondering why, when you hit the record button, the videos you make aren't looking quite as good as your friends or anyone else you've seen with that camera, for that matter. Other videos online might have shown you how to get cinematic footage, and that's easy for them to say with their $4,000 cameras. So I'm gonna try and help you fix your footage today with some basic advice. And no, I'm not gonna tell you to go buy a new camera. No, for the rest of this video, I'm gonna use a camera you can get for about $300 off eBay right now used, the GX85. It's a 3-year-old budget micro 4/3 sensor camera with shitty autofocus. So we're on the GX85 now. Step 1 is get yourself a gray card. It gives you a neutral gray to set your white balance. Almost all cameras have a custom white balance setting or function. Use this gray card to set your white balance every time your environment changes, from inside to outside or time of day. It will make the colors all look the way that they're supposed to look, and instead of like an extra orange or extra blue. Step 2 is to learn your camera. There are a lot of different camera manufacturers, but all digital cameras follow the same basic principle. There's a sensor. That sensor records light as data. The lens you put in front of that sensor then focuses the light onto the sensor and gives you additional control over how much light hits the sensor in the form of an aperture. The aperture is the hole in the middle of the lens and is also called an f-stop. A small hole or a large f number will make your background less blurry and give you less light. A large hole or a small f number gives you more light and a more blurry background. ISO or ISO is basically turning the gain up or down on your sensor. So the higher that ISO, the more grainy and gainy it is going to look. Then you have your shutter speed. The most cinematic shutter speed is going to be something called the 180-degree rule. It means your shutter speed should be 1 over twice your frame rate. So if you set your frame rate at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1 over 48 or 1/48th of a second. That rule can be broken sometimes. If you're recording sports, for instance, you might want it to be faster, but we're going to avoid doing that for right now. The 180-degree rule creates just the right amount of motion blur for creating an immersive video experience. And it's why most of the time that's what professionals use. Also, most movies are shot in 24 frames per second, technically 23.98 frames per second, but it's really just a matter of preference. I use 23.98 frames per second. So all this means, to control the light hitting your sensor, if your shutter speed is fixed with the 180-degree rule, you only have aperture and ISO to control the exposure of your image. And if you have an inexpensive camera, your ISO generally should not go above 800, otherwise it will start to look really, really bad. So I usually try and keep my ISO around 200 or 400, even on my more expensive cameras. And you're also going to want a really low f number if you want to have any blurry background. This is where you learn that your camera only has one job, and that's to record light. And the way to make your video look more professional is to change the amount of light hitting the sensor. And you can do that in a few ways. You can buy lights, or you can manipulate the available light. We'll come back to that in just a second. Step 3 goes back into your camera settings or configuration. You're going to want to figure out your bitrate. Now, most cameras have an option called image quality or video quality or bitrate. Sometimes you have to set it to high if it's the image quality setting like Nikon, or in some cases there's actually a number attached to it like 50 or 100 megabits per second. That's your bitrate. If you're recording in 4K, you're not going to want to go much lower than 100 megabits per second. That's where you should try and start. And if you're recording in 1080p, try to never go below 25 megabits per second. Two of the biggest differences between regular phone cameras and real cameras is the bitrate and the sensor size. Really active scenes with lots of variation in color, like confetti exploding or something, will turn into a mushy mess if the bitrate is too low. Also, bitrate determines how much color information is stored, so if you're applying LUTs or doing any type of interesting color grading, the higher the bitrate, the better. If you go too high though, your file sizes can become ridiculous, especially if you don't have any workflow for dealing with tens or hundreds of gigabytes of footage. So with that, 100 megabits per second is generally a safe middle of the road. Alright, so step 4 is lighting. Learning good lighting is really a process, and there's a world of information out there, but I'm just gonna start by telling you what I like to use in my studio. If you're filming indoors, you should invest in a good light. My favorite light for my studio work is the Aperture 120D Mark I and the Aperture 120D Mark II. I use the 120D Mark I because it is very silent, very bright, offers great color quality, can be battery powered, and is remote controlled. So I can just leave it plugged in and turn it on wirelessly when I'm ready to make a video. I use that paired with a parabolic softbox and an egg crate grid on a C-stand to hold all the weight. This allows me to control or manipulate the light into a soft directional source that doesn't actually light up my entire room. And I also use the Aperture 120D Mark II. It offers the same advantages as the 120D Mark I, it's just a little bit brighter, it dims all the way down to 1% instead of to just 10%, and it has some special effects built in. It also has less wires running everywhere, has a better handbrake on the yoke for when the mounted accessories get a little too heavy, and I use it as my back or hair light over here with the Aperture Fresnel 2X modifier and the Aperture barn doors in front of that. It's also mounted in a location that is physically easier for me to grab and pack it up for when I need to take it with me somewhere, because it is a better light than the 120D Mark I, and that's the one that I would want to take with me. I keep the 120D Mark I, my key light, over here in a more permanently mounted location. I also use a variety of RGB lights. You can use them to accent backgrounds or make an otherwise neutral scene pop. If you want something that just plugs in and turns off and on really easily, kind of like Aperture's lights with a remote, but doesn't break the bank, you might consider using what I use, and that's the CameTV Bolton Andromeda RGB Slim Tube. It's one of the cheapest remote-controlled RGB options that I've seen, and it has become a staple in my studio ever since I picked it up. And if you're outside on a sunny day and you want a blurry background, you can control the available light by getting yourself an ND filter, a neutral density filter. It's a thing that screws onto the front of your lens to reduce the amount of light available to your sensor. I would recommend a variable ND for your first one. They're very flexible and you can get them for fairly cheap, especially if you're learning. It's a great tool to learn with. So if you're using your neutral density filter and you expose your sunny background so you can actually see the sky, but your subject then becomes too dark, you can then either get more lights and use those on your set, or you can get a cheap 5-in-1 reflector. You can use the 5-in-1 reflector to bounce light back onto the shady side of your subject and then illuminate them. There's also a translucent diffusion piece you can use to shade your subject from the sun, but also provide a more diffused light instead of the hard light that the sun usually provides. It also has a negative fill, a silver reflector, and a gold reflector, and they're very cheap. Also, when you're using lights, try not to shine them directly into the lens of your camera. It can create lens flare, and not the good kind. It will then wash out your whole image, and it will generally look pretty bad. If your camera has in-body image stabilization or your lens has stabilization, it's actually a very helpful tool and really useful if you're holding your camera in your hands. Like if you're vlogging or handhold recording someone walking around or something. Mainly due to reducing the visible effect of rolling shutter. Up and down movements will compress and elongate your image, and lateral movements from side to side will make your image sway like this. And that's called rolling shutter. And almost all cameras, except for very expensive cinema cameras, will experience it. Those have what's called a global shutter, and that records the entire image at the same time. Our cameras have rolling shutter because it records images like from top to bottom really quickly. So if your camera or your lens doesn't have any kind of stabilization, you're going to want to completely avoid doing any handheld type of shots. Get a cheap tripod or something you can set your camera down on so it doesn't move whenever you're recording. Otherwise, your image is going to look like it was recorded on a cell phone due to that rolling shutter and the jello-looking effect that it creates. If you need to handhold your camera, then you might actually consider getting a stabilizer, a stabilized lens, a camera that has a stabilized sensor, or a gimbal. For gimbal work, I use the DJI Ronin S, and it works with every camera that I own. Step 6, focus. If you're using a camera without a flip-out screen that you can see while you're using it, if you're trying to record yourself, nailing focus can be kind of difficult. So to fix that, I usually use the small HD focus most of the time. It's a monitor, it has a really great focus peaking tool so you can see exactly what is in focus when you are manual focusing. It outlines with little blue dots exactly what's in focus, and I find it to be very helpful. If I actually want to record onto the monitor, I will use my Atomos Ninja V. It is another monitor, but also has a slot for a solid state drive, so I can record footage directly onto it. And both of these work with any camera that has an HDMI out port. Some cameras also have a Wi-Fi app that will just pair with your phone, and you can see exactly what is on your camera through your phone screen, and you can tap the screen to have it focus on your face. What I would generally do if I had one of those is tap on my face before I start recording, and then sit into manual focus so the focus doesn't move anywhere, and then start recording. And then you don't have to spend any money. Step 7 is audio. Making sure your videos sound good is sometimes more important than making sure your videos look good. You might actually watch a video with crisp and great sounding audio and pretty terrible video recording, but you can almost never watch a great looking video with horrible audio. If you have an on-camera mic already, get an extension cable and boom it closer to your source of audio just out of frame. It'll sound a million times better. Or if you have a little bit bigger of a budget, you can do what I do, get an external microphone and an external recorder. I use the Mix Pre 3 and I used the Zoom H6 for a long time, so you can plug in an XLR microphone and have everything be completely portable. If you're looking for a great XLR shotgun microphone, I would recommend checking out the DDS Mic 2. It's what I'm talking into right now, and it has almost identical qualities to my Sennheiser MKH 416. This one's $1,000, and the one that I'm talking into now is only a third of that price. Step 8 is write your scripts. You could have all the other things down, but going into recording a video without having any idea of what you're actually going to say can make your video seem very unprofessional, especially if you don't have a ton of experience editing. It's not super easy to stand in front of a camera and deliver a video. And editing out a million ums or uhs creates an unnatural flow of jump cuts, and leaving them in looks even worse. Also, it eats up a ton of your hard drive space if you have 30 minutes of slow talking and thinking of what you're going to say instead of 5 minutes of flowing audio while reading a script. You can download a free teleprompter app and just stick your phone above your camera to read it, kind of like what I'm doing right now. Step 9 is learn to edit. Color grading is becoming a much more popular subject. With the ease of access to distribution on YouTube, everyone wants to be a star. You can download LUTs and easily slip a mood or a color onto your footage, or you can just tweak a few settings and make your own presets or LUTs to work with the camera that you like to use the most. Do some research on whatever editing tools you use. DaVinci Resolve is powerful and free. Premiere Pro is powerful but costs some money. It also crashes a lot. I mean, iMovie comes on your Mac, but it isn't really fully featured. There's plenty of options. Just do some research and learn how to make editing an easier process for you. You'll save a bunch of time as you get better. And you can also edit your audio to make it sound better. For that, I use Adobe Audition. It also helps the flow of your video if you edit B-roll over jump cuts in dialogue. It hides the cut and it makes it seem like it was a more natural flow, or that the dialogue was intended to be that way. If these tips helped you at all, give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to watch more of my videos. If you want to buy any of the things that I suggested or that I use, I put links to all of that in the video description. They are affiliate links, so I will earn a small commission if you use them. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. The community that we're building here is very helpful, and I'll answer whatever I can. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.